It's no coincidence that you are hearing this now. You didn't arrive out of curiosity or by accident. If these words crossed your path at this moment, it is because the message could not wait any longer. What was revealed was not delivered in advance, not programmed to generate anticipation. It was communicated with absolute urgency because time, as we have spiritually understood it, is running out. The Virgin Mary spoke a few hours ago. She didn't speak to the whole world, but to those hearts that still know how to listen when heaven whispers. The message was clear and direct, without embellishment, without lengthy explanations. Tomorrow, December 2nd, 2025, marks a point of no return. It is not a symbol, not a randomly chosen mystical date, but a silent boundary between a before sustained by mercy and an after sustained by consequences. Since dawn, people in different countries began to feel the same thing without having communicated with each other. An inexplicable pressure in the chest, a feeling of anticipation, as if something were about to happen and the soul knew it before the mind. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anxiety, it was certainty, the kind of certainty that isn't learned, that isn't reasoned, that is simply recognized. When a person reaches a certain inner stability, something happens that few expect. The process doesn't become easier, it becomes more refined. The tests cease to be obvious and begin to manifest as small, almost imperceptible deviations. Maria explained that this is the most delicate moment of the journey because the clarity acquired can generate a false sense of arrival, and where the idea of having arrived appears, distraction begins. The final tests don't reveal major errors, but rather minor adjustments that are poorly handled, small inconsistencies that are tolerated because they seem harmless, a word that no longer arises from silence, but from the need to be right. An action that seeks subtle recognition, an omission justified by exhaustion. None of this seems serious, but together they weaken the core. Maria warned that this type of misalignment isn't detected from a moral standpoint, but rather from an inner feeling of heaviness that begins to appear without apparent cause. One of the greatest challenges of this stage is the confusion between stability and control. True stability is flexible. Control, on the other hand, attempts to protect what has been achieved by becoming rigid. Maria was clear in pointing out that control stems from the fear of losing clarity and, paradoxically, is what erodes it. When a person begins to excessively organize their spiritual life, to establish rigid routines, to react with discomfort to the unexpected, it is a sign that the center of gravity is shifting. In this phase, an old temptation reappears in a new guise, spiritual self-criticism. The person no longer judges themselves for obvious mistakes, but for subtle flaws, for not feeling enough peace, for occasional doubts, for growing weary. Maria explained that this refined self-criticism can become more harmful than the initial neglect, because where there is constant pressure, the heart becomes tense, and a tense heart does not listen clearly. Another sign of this trial is the increasing difficulty in resting without guilt. Even when the body begs for a break, the mind insists on sustaining the effort. Maria pointed out that learning to rest without making excuses is one of the ultimate liberations from the spiritual ego. Conscious rest is not abandoning the path. It is part of the path. Resisting it generates unnecessary exhaustion and opens the door to confusion. A test related to identity also emerges. The person begins to see themselves as someone who understands, someone who has already been through this. This identity, though subtle, creates separation. Maria explained that the true sign of coherence is not being ahead of oneself, but remaining a learner. Continuous learning protects against stagnation. When this attitude is lost, listening weakens. In everyday life, these tests manifest themselves in simple situations. A conversation where the need to correct the other person arises, a disagreement experienced with excessive discomfort, an internal criticism that appears when someone doesn't validate a decision made sincerely. Maria warned that these reactions shouldn't be repressed or denied. They should be observed honestly because they reveal where the ego still seeks to hold on. Another key test is the relationship with uncertainty. As the process unfolds, the person feels they should understand more, foresee more, control better. However, the profound spiritual path moves in the opposite direction, toward trust without guarantees. Maria explained that this stage requires letting go of the illusion of understanding everything. Truth is experienced, not possessed, and when one tries to possess it, it becomes rigid. During this phase, many people experience a sense of apparent stagnation. There are no visible breakthroughs, no new revelations, no intense emotions. Maria was emphatic. This is not stagnation, it is purification. The process clears away the remaining noise. Trying to force progress at this point disrupts that purification. Patience becomes essential, not as a moral virtue, but as a condition for clarity. The temptation also arises to look back and compare, to compare what one felt before with what one feels now, to long for the initial intensity. Maria explained that this nostalgia is understandable, but it shouldn't be the guiding force. Depth doesn't always feel intense. Sometimes it feels simple, and simplicity is often mistaken for loss. In reality, it's maturity. At this stage, relationships with others become even more refined. It becomes clear when a conversation is nourishing and when it's distracting. Not from judgment, but from a sense of strain. The person begins to choose more carefully where to focus their attention, not because they reject it, but because they are protecting their balance. Maria clarified that this selection shouldn't turn into isolation. It's a delicate dance between presence and withdrawal. A test related to service also appears. The desire to help can become intertwined with the need to feel needed. Maria warned that when service doesn't stem from listening, it becomes interference. Knowing when to act and when to withdraw is an advanced sign of coherence. Timely silence is as much service as active presence. One phrase from the message resonates strongly at this point. Not everything that is good for others is necessary for you right now. This demands deep discernment. The tendency to say yes to everything, however noble, becomes exhausting at this stage. Learning to say no gently becomes essential, not as rejection, but as fidelity to the inner process. Maria also spoke of the test of sustained trust. Not the initial trust that arises with revelation, but the trust that remains when there are no new signs. This mature trust is not based on experiences, but on presence, and it is precisely this trust that prepares one for the next stage. Without it, expansion would be experienced as a threat. Towards the end of this section, the message points out something important. Those who go through these final trials often feel alone, even if they aren't. This happens because the process is no longer easily shared with others. Not out of secrecy, but because it becomes difficult to explain. Maria asked that this solitude not be interpreted as abandonment. It is a space for profound recalibration. There, the most intimate listening is honed. The final instruction for this phase is both simple and demanding. Return to the center again and again without dramatizing the detours. The path isn't broken by a brief straying, it's broken by not returning. Learning to return gently is the greatest sign of deep coherence. What comes next marks the transition to a different state, the conscious dwelling in complete silence, where one no longer responds to tests but lives from a stable presence that naturally transforms everything around it. This phase is not learned, it is embodied. And it can only be approached after passing through these final tests without hardening one's heart. The final phase doesn't arrive with new signs, nor with additional words from heaven. It arrives in the most silent way of all, when there is no longer any need for confirmation. Mary explained that this is the point where the search stops not from exhaustion, but from recognition. The soul ceases to look outward, waiting for answers, and begins to inhabit what has always been there. Not as an idea, but as a state of being. Living in silence doesn't mean isolating oneself from the world. It means living without inner escape, remaining present even when not everything is resolved, accepting uncertainty without turning it into anxiety. At this point, a person no longer constantly asks what comes next, because they understand that each step is revealed only when the foot touches the ground. Complete silence doesn't promise certainty, it offers stability. Maria was clear in saying that the biggest mistake would be to think this state is passivity. On the contrary, it is the state of greatest clarity. From this perspective, decisions become simple, not because life is easy, but because inner confusion no longer dictates. Fear loses its power. It doesn't disappear entirely, but it ceases to govern. Action arises from coherence, not impulse, and this change profoundly transforms the experience of living. In this final stage, the person recognizes something essential. The process wasn't meant to transform them into someone else, but to return them to who they always were. Everything added out of fear, pressure, or excessive adaptation begins to fall away, not violently but with relief. Identity lightens. It's no longer necessary to maintain rigid narratives about oneself. Simply being is enough. Maria spoke of this state as the restored inner house, not a perfect house, but a habitable one, a place to which a person can return, even amidst external noise. This house is not lost through mistakes or difficult days. It weakens only when inner honesty is abandoned. As long as that honesty remains, everything can be overcome. The message's conclusion was not a warning, a future prophecy, or an extraordinary promise. It was a humble and definitive invitation to live awake without needing constant reminders. Heaven does not seek dependence. It seeks maturity. It seeks children capable of walking without constant supervision, but without forgetting their origin. Therefore, the silence that now settles in is neither punishment nor emptiness. It is trust. It is the space where life becomes sacred again, not through speeches, but through presence. Every simple gesture becomes important. Every carefully chosen word carries weight. Every act of consistency sustains more than one can imagine. Maria said something that sums up the whole journey. When the noise no longer controls you, you can hear me without me speaking. That means the message doesn't end here. It continues in the way you look, in how you decide, in what you choose to keep silent about, and in what you choose to hold on to. The end of the process isn't a goal, it's a way of being, and that way is built every day, in the small, the invisible. If you've reached this point, not because you watched a long video, but because you recognize something true, then the revelation has served its purpose. You don't need to convince anyone. You don't need to announce anything. Simply live from this restored center. That will be the clearest sign that heaven has spoken and been heard. Time didn't close to punish. It closed to purify. The door wasn't closed to exclude. It was closed to protect the truth. And the silence that remains is not the absence of God, but his most intimate way of remaining. Nothing ends here. Here, finally, it begins. The revelation didn't speak of immediate destruction or visible catastrophes, and that was more unsettling than any announcement of chaos, because what was pointed out isn't external, but internal. Tomorrow won't bring a news story that shakes the headlines, but a silent confirmation that will shake consciences. Something that was already in motion becomes irreversible. Something that still had room for correction enters a new phase. The Virgin Mary was very clear in a statement that shook even those who have decades of deep faith. After tomorrow, many will continue walking as if nothing has changed, but they will no longer be in the same spiritual place. She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. The statement contained the full weight of the message. It's not about what is seen, but about what is lost when one doesn't listen in time. This message is not for distracted crowds or those seeking spiritual spectacle. It is for the weary, the sensitive, those who have felt something shift within them this year. For those who wept for no apparent reason, for those who felt life grow heavier as if their soul were being pushed toward a decision it had been avoiding. For several nights now, the sky has been strangely still. There are no striking phenomena, no obvious signs, but those who pray recognize this stillness. It is the calm that precedes a final act. It is not a threat, but a spiritual formality. When heaven decides to close a cycle, it does so silently, respecting human freedom until the very last second. An elderly woman who has lived more than 70 years in constant prayer said something that sums up what many feel. I didn't hear a voice, but I felt a door gently close. It wasn't violent. It wasn't dramatic. It was final. That's how heavenly decisions work, quietly but irrevocably. Maria didn't speak of punishment. She spoke of responsibility. She didn't ask to run away. She didn't ask to accumulate things. She didn't ask for external signs. She asked for clarity. She asked for inner silence. She asked that each soul observe what it has been avoiding seeing. Because the change that begins doesn't separate the good from the bad. It separates the conscious from the distracted. Tomorrow won't trigger a new event, but rather confirm something that was already happening. That was one of the hardest things to accept. What will happen tomorrow doesn't begin tomorrow. It begins now, but it becomes clear to those who know how to read the signs. December 2nd doesn't introduce something unknown. It seals something that has been foretold for some time. Many will live the day like any other. They will wake up, do their chores, and talk about ordinary things. But something will begin to unsettle them. The inconsistency will weigh heavily. The masks will become uncomfortable. The lukewarmness will cease to be comforting. And that will not be a punishment. It will be the natural consequence of the light intensifying. The message wasn't sent to create panic, but to offer one last chance for conscious alignment. Because after that point, decisions will no longer be easy, not by imposition, but by resonance. Every choice will echo. Every silence will have an inner response. Every denial will weigh more heavily than before. Maria expressed something with profound sorrow and tenderness. Some will hear now and rest. Others will understand later, but with difficulty. There is no threat in those words, only love that warns before time changes its rhythm, because true love does not wait for pain to teach. This year has been an intense preparation. Nothing you've experienced was random. Every loss, every trial, every confusion had a purpose, to sharpen the ear of the soul, because what is coming will not be recognized by the senses, but by inner perception. Those who haven't practiced silence will have difficulty understanding what is beginning to manifest. If you're listening to this now, don't do so superficially. Don't just watch. Because from this point on, the content enters a section that can't be received hastily or with distraction. What follows explains why tomorrow is spiritually precise, what is specifically activated, and what the silent decision is that each soul must make without public announcements. From then on, it will no longer be just about listening to a message. It will be a matter of recognizing whether you are prepared to bear it. From the moment the message was delivered, it was clear that tomorrow would not be an ordinary day, even though it may seem so to many. What is being activated does not depend on the human calendar, but on the spiritual order that governs invisible processes. When Mary spoke of hours and not months, she was pointing to something precise. The adjustment has already begun and is now entering its confirmation phase. This is not an imposed punishment, but a consequence that manifests itself when the light advances and leaves no room for what lived in darkness. The revelation describes a change that is unseen but felt with absolute clarity. Starting tomorrow, the human soul will no longer be able to live comfortably in contradiction. For years it was possible to maintain spiritual discourses without inner coherence, to feign peace while nurturing fear, to speak of love while silently judging. That period is coming to an end, not through condemnation, but because the vibration of time is changing. The inner lie will no longer find refuge. Mary expressed it in a way that moved even those who received the message. The light doesn't pursue anyone, but when it shines, it compels us to see. That phrase encapsulates the entire process that is beginning. There will be no persecution, no imposition, no external judgment, but each conscience will find itself facing its own reflection. What could previously be ignored will begin to demand attention, and that, for many, will be profoundly uncomfortable. The message explains that tomorrow marks the beginning of what has been called the stage of irreversible discernment. Until now, it was still possible to be confused without profound consequences, to postpone decisions, to numb one's conscience. From this point forward, every choice will carry spiritual weight, not because heaven will judge more harshly, but because the soul will be more awakened. And an awakened soul cannot feign ignorance without suffering inner turmoil. Many people will feel a kind of weariness that's hard to explain. It won't be physical. It will be a weariness of living on autopilot, of repeating patterns, of having empty conversations, of nurturing relationships that no longer resonate with the truth. Others will feel an urgency to organize their lives, to clear their spaces, to close chapters, to reconcile. They won't know exactly why, but they'll feel that not doing so weighs heavily on them. This pressure doesn't come from fear, but from the coherence that is beginning to take hold. Maria was clear in saying that not everyone will react the same way. The process will be silent, personal, and gradual. Some will perceive it immediately. Others will take days. Still others will only understand when the inner turmoil becomes evident. But no one will remain completely untouched, because what changes is the spiritual field that envelops humanity. And when that field adjusts, everything within it must reorganize itself. One of the most sensitive aspects of the revelation is this: the message doesn't seek to convince those who deny, but to protect those who feel. Maria knows there will be mockery, indifference, denial. That doesn't change the process. Change doesn't depend on human approval. It is activated because it is part of a larger cycle that has been foretold for decades. What was once a warning is now a silent manifestation. During the transmission of the message, it became very clear that after tomorrow, there will be no more visible warnings. The heavens have spoken enough. From that point on, the signs will be internal, more intense dreams, thoughts that cannot be ignored, and discomforts that can no longer be soothed by distraction. The soul will begin to speak in a language that many have forgotten how to hear, and those who do not listen now will find it much harder to hear later. It was also revealed that this process is not short. Tomorrow nothing ends. Something begins that will unfold in stages. But tomorrow is the threshold. Whoever crosses that threshold with awareness will find guidance. Whoever crosses it in resistance will find confusion. Not because heaven wills it so, but because resistance to the truth always generates internal friction. Maria emphasized something fundamental. It's not about perfection, but about honesty. It doesn't demand immediate holiness, but inner disposition. The process doesn't require never making mistakes. It requires not lying to oneself. Those who are able to recognize their true state without justifying it will find relief. Those who try to maintain appearances will experience increasing exhaustion. Many people ask what exactly they should do. The message answers with a disconcerting simplicity. Cultivate inner silence and observe. Do not react impulsively. Do not panic. Do not look for someone to blame. Simply observe what is uncomfortable, what weighs you down, what resonates, what no longer fits. This observation is the gateway, because true discernment is not imposed. It reveals itself when given space. The revelation also mentions that this change will especially affect those who bear responsibility for others, parents, leaders, spiritual guides, not as punishment, but as a calling. Starting tomorrow, supporting others through inconsistency will be particularly exhausting. Energy will no longer allow for prolonged facades. Authority that does not stem from truth will begin to erode. None of this happens to destroy. It happens to reorder. True love always reorders before it heals. That's why the process feels uncomfortable at first, because habit resists. But once you cross that threshold, a new feeling arrives. Lightness. Not euphoria, not exaggerated emotion. Inner lightness, coherence, deep rest. Maria closed this part of her message with a phrase that defies explanation. It can only be felt. Those who walk in truth will not fear the silence that is to come. She didn't speak of future noise. She spoke of silence. A silence where there will no longer be enough distractions to escape from oneself, and only those who have reconciled with their inner selves will be able to inhabit that silence without anguish. All of this doesn't come into effect by human decree. It doesn't depend on someone believing or sharing it. It's activated because spiritual time moves forward. And when it moves forward, it does so with mercy, but also with firmness. Heaven doesn't retreat once the process begins. If you've made it this far, you're already part of the movement, not as part of a group, but as an engaged individual. What follows in the next section focuses not on the general, but on the personal, on how this change begins to manifest itself concretely in decisions, relationships, emotions, and paths that open or close. From part 3 onward, the revelation enters the realm that was almost forbidden to discuss. How to recognize whether you are aligned or resisting, and what inner sign will indicate that you have consciously crossed the threshold. The change that has begun to unfold doesn't present itself loudly or spectacularly. It doesn't arrive with external warnings or easily interpreted signs. Its true manifestation occurs on a more delicate plane, the human interior. That's why many people will feel something happening without being able to name it. They won't be able to explain it in words, but they will recognize it in the way certain things no longer fit. What was once tolerated now weighs heavily. What was once justified now causes discomfort. And what was once ignored begins to call out insistently. Maria made it clear that this is the most evident sign of having crossed the threshold, the loss of comfort in inconsistency. It is not guilt, it is not punishment, it is not condemnation. It is active lucidity. The soul can no longer find solace in that which contradicts its deepest truth. From this point on, conscience ceases to be an occasional whisper and becomes a constant presence. It does not accuse, but it accompanies. It does not push, but it points. And whoever tries to silence it feels an emptiness that did not exist before. One of the most sensitive aspects of the message is that this process doesn't separate people based on ideologies, religions, or outward appearances. The separation occurs through inner disposition. There are those who, even without religious rhetoric, live with inner honesty and therefore navigate the change with relative peace. There are others who constantly speak of faith, but maintain a constant inner struggle, and for them, the process becomes more intense. It's not about labels, it's about consistency. Maria explained that many relationships will begin to transform. Some will be strengthened by a deeper truth, others will dissolve without conflict, like leaves falling when they have served their purpose. Attachment will be tested. Not because loving is wrong, but because loving from a place of dependency will no longer be sustainable. The new era demands connections based on freedom and inner truth. Where that is lacking, there will be erosion, not as a forced breakup, but as a natural distancing. They also discussed a very specific sign that will mark those resisting the process: an obsessive need for noise. They will seek constant distractions, empty conversations, excessive stimulation. Not because they want to, but because the silence begins to confront them. Silence reveals what has been postponed, and not everyone is ready to see it. That's why noise becomes a temporary refuge. However, that refuge wears out quickly, and when it does, the discomfort returns with greater intensity. The message clarifies something fundamental. Resisting doesn't mean being lost. It means the soul is still negotiating. The process doesn't demand immediate perfection. It demands progressive honesty. Every small act of inner sincerity relieves the pressure. Every acknowledgement, however painful, frees up space. Change doesn't push anyone into the abyss. It pushes them toward the center. And the center is always less chaotic than fear imagines. Maria spoke with particular tenderness about those who carry old guilt. She explained that much of this guilt doesn't stem from the original mistake, but from a refusal to forgive oneself. From this point on, sustained guilt becomes especially heavy, not because heaven imposes it, but because it no longer serves any purpose. This new era isn't based on punishment, but on integrated learning. Those who continue to carry unnecessary guilt will feel exhausted. Those who allow themselves to learn and let go will feel relief. Another clear sign of the process is the change in the perception of time. Many people will feel that the days pass more quickly, but at the same time, certain hours become heavy. This happens because consciousness begins to inhabit the present more fully. The past loses its power. The future loses its anxiety. The now intensifies, and in that now, it becomes impossible to escape oneself. That intensity can feel like pressure or clarity, depending on one's inner state. The message also speaks of decisions that will begin to arise unexpectedly. Not as grand, dramatic choices, but as small shifts that change course. A pending conversation, a door that opens, an opportunity that can no longer be ignored, a truth that can no longer be silenced. Not all decisions will be comfortable, but all will be necessary. The criterion for recognizing them will be simple. What arises from coherence brings peace after fear. What is born from fear brings unease after comfort. Maria insisted that no one should force themselves to act rashly. The process doesn't call for impulsiveness, it calls for presence, to observe before reacting, to feel before deciding. True discernment requires pause, and that pause is precisely what the world has forgotten. That's why those who manage to stop for a few minutes each day, breathe and listen, will navigate change with much greater clarity than those who try to control everything. There was also talk of an increase in spiritual sensitivity. People who previously noticed nothing will begin to perceive others' emotions, heavy atmospheres, or empty spaces. It's not a new gift, but a memory awakening. Humanity is recovering a perception that had lain dormant beneath the rush and noise. This sensitivity should not be used to judge, but to care, to be mindful of where we spend our time, with whom we share, what we consume, and what we allow into our inner selves. The message is clear in something that contradicts many expectations. The process doesn't accelerate if more people know about it. It deepens if more people experience it silently. It's not about spreading the word, but about integrating it. Those who feel the need to convince others are probably running away from their own process. On the other hand, those who experience change with humility become a beacon without saying a word. Consistency always speaks louder than words. Maria warned that extreme voices, rigid interpretations, and attempts to manipulate the message to generate fear or control will arise. This will happen because some will not tolerate the inner freedom that this process awakens. But the principle remains the same. Where there is imposed fear, there is no truth. Where there is serene clarity, even in the midst of pain, there is the path. Discernment becomes essential at this stage. One phrase from the message resonated particularly strongly. Those who don't look at themselves now will look at themselves later without the comfort of silence. It's not a threat. It's a description. Silence accompanies those who enter it willingly. Noise pursues those who flee. Therefore, the gift of this time is the possibility of entering it consciously. No one is obligated, but everyone is invited. From this point on, many will begin to feel an unexpected need to declutter their material lives, cleaning spaces, letting go of objects, simplifying routines. It's not an obsession, it's an internal reflection. External order accompanies internal reorganization. It's not about minimalism, it's about coherence. What no longer represents who you are begins to become superfluous. And letting go brings relief. This part of the message was hardly conveyed because it requires maturity. It's not well understood through mere curiosity. It's only truly grasped through experience. That's why those who feel nothing now shouldn't force it. The process reaches each person at their own precise moment. But those who already feel the inner stirring would do well not to ignore it. Resistance doesn't stop the process, it only intensifies it. What follows in the next part goes even deeper. It will no longer be about general signs, but about how to recognize internally whether one is in alignment or resistance, and what the inner gesture is that marks the true crossing of the threshold. This gesture is not public, it is not announced, but it completely transforms the way one inhabits the world. At this point, the message ceases to be descriptive and becomes intimate. It no longer speaks of external signs or general changes, but of the inner gesture that defines whether a person is moving forward with the process or resisting it. Maria was clear in stating that it is not a public decision, nor an ideological stance, nor a visible act. The crossing of the threshold occurs silently within each consciousness and is recognized by a very specific change in the way one relates to the truth. This gesture isn't about making promises or vows. It's about ceasing to justify oneself. The message explains that for a long time, humanity learned to justify itself in order to survive, to excuse actions, rationalize inconsistencies, and soften internal lies. This mechanism was tolerated out of mercy, but from this point on, maintaining it generates constant friction. The soul begins to tire of self-explanation. It longs for rest, and rest only comes with honest acceptance of what is. Maria described this moment as lucid surrender, which should not be confused with resignation. It is not giving up on life, but rather relinquishing the struggle against one's own conscience. Those who surrender lucidly and lovingly experience a new peace, unlike any previous relief. It is not enthusiasm, not euphoria, but settlement, as if something within has finally found its place. This settlement is the clearest sign of having crossed the threshold. The message warns that many will mistake this process for a loss of meaning. In reality, the opposite occurs. The false meaning is lost so that the real one can emerge. During this transition, there may be a feeling of emptiness, of pause, of suspension. It is not absence, it is space. The soul creates space for a more coherent way of living. Resisting this emptiness generates anxiety. Allowing it brings clarity. And this clarity doesn't arrive suddenly. It arrives like a soft light that expands over time. Mary also spoke of a change in the way we pray. For many, prayer will cease to be a list of requests and will become a sustained presence. There will be less need to say so much. Simply being present will suffice. This form of prayer doesn't arise from effort, but from coherence. When life is ordered from within, prayer ceases to be a tool and becomes breath itself. The message emphasizes that this is the prayer that sustains this new era. Another sign of crossing the threshold is a shift in how we perceive others. Where there was once hasty judgment, there begins to be quiet understanding. Not approval of everything, but comprehension of the other person's process. Condemnation loses its power because the person recognizes their own fragility, and from that shared fragility is born a more real, less discursive mercy. Mary pointed out that harsh judgment will become increasingly burdensome for those who uphold it, because they will no longer find internal justification for it. In contrast, those who choose to resist the process will experience an intensification of internal conflict. Not because something external is pursuing them, but because the inconsistency becomes evident. They will try to return to old habits, old routines, old comforts, but something won't fit. The message doesn't condemn this stage, it describes it. It explains that resistance is part of the transition, and that it even has a purpose, to clearly show what no longer nourishes. Maria was especially careful when speaking about pain. She clarified that the pain that appears in this phase is not punishment but a sign of adjustment. Just as the body hurts when it readjusts after an injury, the soul hurts when it corrects an old deviation. This pain should not be romanticized or dramatized. It should be heard. It contains information. Ignoring it prolongs the process. Listening to it softens it. The message says something many will find challenging. From now on, the spiritual excuse loses its power. It won't be enough to say, "That's just how I am. It's always been this way," or "God understands me," to avoid change. God understands, yes, but He also invites. And when that invitation is repeatedly rejected, the discomfort grows. Not as a threat, but as a natural consequence of becoming misaligned with one's own truth. Maria also spoke about small decisions. She insisted that crossing the threshold isn't sealed with a grand, heroic act, but with consistent, sustained micro-decisions, speaking the truth when it's uncomfortable, holding back a hurtful word, choosing silence when the ego tries to take over, stepping away from what is toxic, even if it's familiar. These decisions may seem insignificant, but they build the foundation of a new inner state. The message indicates that those who consciously cross this threshold will not become perfect or enlightened. They will become responsible for their inner selves. They will stop constantly blaming their environment for their emotional state. They will begin to recognize themselves as active participants in their own process. This responsibility is not a burden, it liberates. Because it returns to human beings the power to choose to align themselves each day, even amidst imperfection. Maria warned that there will be a period of selective solitude, not isolation, but selection. Some people will feel less interested in certain conversations, dynamics, or environments, not out of superiority, but due to sensitivity. The energy becomes more subtle, and certain environments feel heavy. The message asks not to judge this, but to understand it. Everyone finds their natural space in the process. Forcing affinities leads to exhaustion. There was also talk of a quiet joy that will begin to emerge. Not the boisterous joy of before, but a serene satisfaction, a feeling of being in the right place, even without complete answers. This joy is a sign of the ongoing alignment. It can coexist with sadness, with doubts, with weariness. It doesn't eliminate them, it sustains them, and that's why it's deeper. Maria made it clear that this process is not about creating a spiritual elite. Anyone who feels superior simply because they feel aligned has already gone astray. The true sign of this transition is growing humility. The understanding that everyone is learning, each at their own pace. This new era is not built on comparisons, but on presence. In this phase, many people will feel their lives simplify internally, even if externally they remain complex. Mental noise diminishes. Decisions become clearer, not because there are fewer options, but because there is more honesty. This inner simplicity is the foundation for what comes next. Without it, the next stage will be experienced as a burden, with it, as expansion. The message concludes this section with a very precise observation. The threshold is not crossed once, it is inhabited. This means that there is no single day when everything is resolved. There is a state that one chooses to maintain. Each day offers the same choice, to return to comfortable incoherence or to remain in life-giving truth. Heaven does not punish falls, it accompanies the return, but it no longer negotiates the direction. What follows in the next part will delve even deeper into how to recognize, in daily experience, the signs of stable alignment and the more subtle traps of spiritual resistance. It will reveal why many confuse peace with avoidance and how to discern between the two without self-deception. At this stage, the process ceases to feel abstract and begins to manifest in everyday life. It is no longer limited to internal perceptions or moments of silence. It begins to influence simple decisions, spontaneous reactions, and the way each person lives their day. Maria explained that the true sign of alignment is not the absence of conflict, but the speed with which it is recognized. Where pride once lingered, now a pause appears. Where denial once prevailed, now an honest question arises. This subtle shift is evidence that consciousness is awake. One of the clearest effects is the shift in our internal dialogue. The voice that once justified everything begins to lose its power. It doesn't disappear immediately, but it no longer dominates. In its place, a calmer voice emerges that doesn't explain, it simply names. It says, "This isn't coherent. This no longer nourishes. This distances you from yourself." It doesn't accuse, it doesn't impose, it points out. And that signal, when heeded, releases energy. When ignored, it weighs you down. Maria emphasized that learning to listen without reacting impulsively will be one of the core skills of this time. Many people will notice that certain habits lose their appeal, not because new rules are being imposed, but because the awakened consciousness no longer finds pleasure in what weakens it. This can be confusing at first. Some interpret this loss of interest as sadness or emptiness. In reality, it's space, a space that hasn't yet been filled by something new. Maria asked us not to rush to fill it. Clean space is fertile. Forcing it with distractions delays integration. The message also speaks of the test of spiritual pride, a particularly subtle trap at this stage. As clarity grows, the temptation arises to compare oneself, to feel ahead, to judge others' pace. Maria was direct. Such comparison immediately disrupts the flow of the process. Not because it is serious, but because it shifts the mind back to the wrong focus. The focus is not on who goes further, but on who remains more authentic. Humility is not felt as inferiority, it is felt as relief. In daily life, alignment is recognized by a very specific quality, silent consistency. There's no need to announce changes, explain decisions, or defend choices. What springs from truth needs no justification. Maria explained that this is one of the clearest signs of spiritual maturity. When something is right for the soul, it's enough to do it. The need to convince others often indicates inner insecurity. Another important sign is the relationship with mistakes. Where there was once self-attack or denial, now there is responsibility without dramatization. The mistake is acknowledged, corrected when possible, and one moves forward without dwelling on guilt. Maria insisted that prolonged guilt no longer serves a purpose. In this new era, rapid learning replaces slow punishment, not because mistakes don't matter, but because an awakened conscience learns faster. This phase also brings changes in how we approach the suffering of others. The aligned person stops trying to save everyone and begins to accompany without intruding. They understand that each process is unique and that intervening uninvited is often a way of escaping one's own path. Maria emphasized that respecting the other person's pace is a profound form of love, and that timely silence can be more healing than 1,000 pieces of advice. A heightened sensitivity to language also emerges. Words that once seemed neutral now feel weighty. Tone becomes important. The intention behind the phrase is clearly perceived. This isn't about censorship, it's about refinement. Language is creation, and when consciousness is refined, language demands coherence. Maria explained that every word uttered without awareness drains energy, while every necessary word organizes it. At this stage, many will feel the urge to tidy up old loose ends, to ask for forgiveness, to close unfinished conversations, to resolve postponed issues, not out of external obligation but for inner relief. Keeping matters open becomes energetically costly. Closing them, even imperfectly, restores presence. Maria clarified that an ideal resolution won't always be possible. Sometimes an internal gesture of honesty is enough for the burden to dissolve. The message also mentions a readjustment in the relationship with the future. Anxiety decreases not because everything is clear, but because the person begins to trust their inner guidance. The future ceases to be a threat and becomes an open space. This isn't about naivete, but about alignment. When the internal foundation is stable, external change doesn't disrupt it. And in times of transition, that stability is invaluable. There will be moments of fatigue, and it's important not to confuse them with setbacks. The body accompanies what the soul processes. Resting is not surrendering. Pausing is not failing. Maria insisted that this process shouldn't be rushed. Trying to force it creates resistance. Honoring the body's rhythms facilitates the integration of the spirit. Grace doesn't compete with nature. It flows through it. For those who have already navigated several layers of the process, a new perception begins to emerge, a quiet confidence that doesn't depend on immediate results. It's not naive optimism, it's a sense of grounding. Even when not everything is understood, there's a feeling of direction. This confidence doesn't eliminate doubt, but it sustains it, and that completely changes the way they move forward. Maria also warned against a common misconception, confusing peace with avoidance. True peace doesn't shy away from necessary conflict. It allows one to navigate it without inner turmoil. If a decision systematically avoids all friction, it's likely not peace, but rather an escape. Authentic peace can coexist with difficult conversations as long as the truth is upheld. Learning to distinguish between the two will be key at this stage. As coherence stabilizes, life begins to respond differently. Not magically, but organically. Subtle synchronicities appear. Precise encounters, opportunities aligned with the present moment. Not everything becomes easy, but it becomes meaningful. The feeling of being swimming against the current diminishes. And although challenges persist, they are faced from a different perspective. The message makes it clear that no one is left out of the process. Some enter consciously, others through friction, some through clarity, others through exhaustion. The path is the same, the experience changes. Therefore, there is no room for superiority or contempt. Everyone is learning. The difference lies in how much unnecessary suffering is added. Toward the end of this stage, the person begins to recognize a very clear sign. Life no longer feels compartmentalized. The spiritual is no longer separate from the everyday. Prayer is not just a moment. Presence extends into action, speech, and decision-making. This integration is the foundation for the next step. Without it, expansion becomes unstable. With it, it becomes natural. Maria left a final observation for this section, brief and powerful. Whoever learns to dwell in the small truth will be ready to bear the great. She wasn't referring to future secrets, but to greater responsibilities. The process prepares one to serve without becoming exhausted, to love without losing oneself, to act without inner turmoil. What follows in the next part will move toward the stabilization phase, revealing how the process consolidates and what signs indicate that the person is not only crossing the threshold, but also learning to live from it. The final tests of this stage and the profound meaning of the intensifying silence will be addressed. At this point, the process begins to show its most challenging side, not because it is violent, but because it is sustained. The stabilization phase is not heralded by intense emotions or clear signs. It is recognized by the daily repetition of small choices. Maria explained that many imagine awakening as a decisive moment, but in reality, true transformation occurs when consciousness remains awake in the ordinary. That is where the authenticity of the change is tested. At first, stabilization feels like a loss of intensity. After the revelations, the inner turmoil, and the moments of profound clarity, a quieter stage arrives. Some become uneasy and believe they have regressed. Maria was very clear about this. Silence doesn't indicate absence, it indicates integration. When something is integrated, it ceases to attract attention. It becomes part of the internal structure. And that, while less exciting, is infinitely more solid. One of the clearest signs of this stage is the reduction of inner conflict. Not because difficulties disappear, but because the mind stops amplifying them. The person begins to respond more proportionately. They don't react immediately. They observe, they feel, they choose. That small interval between stimulus and response is the sign that consciousness has gained ground. Maria called that interval the place of freedom. There, neither habit nor fear rules. There, presence reigns. In contrast, those who fail to find stability tend to constantly seek new spiritual experiences. They jump from message to message, from practice to practice, hoping to recapture the initial intensity. Maria warned against this tendency. She didn't condemn it, but described it as a form of escapism. Depth isn't found by accumulating stimuli, but by dwelling in what has already been understood. Truth, once seen, demands to be lived, not repeated. During this phase, very subtle tests appear. They aren't obvious temptations, but small misalignments, an unnecessary word, a convenient omission, an internal negotiation to avoid an honest conversation. Maria explained that these tests aren't meant to tear down, but to measure. They don't judge, they calibrate. They show how much of the truth already holds true naturally and how much still requires conscious attention. The message emphasizes that no one goes through this stage perfectly. Stumbling is still part of the journey. The difference is that now the stumble is recognized quickly. The person doesn't spend days or weeks justifying themselves. They feel the dissonance, name it, and return to center. That rapid return is a sign of maturity. Maria affirmed that heaven doesn't focus on the fall, but on the speed of the return. Another feature of stabilization is the change in the relationship with external approval. The need for recognition diminishes. It doesn't disappear completely, but it loses power. The person no longer depends so much on external validation to support their decisions. They remain sensitive, but no longer conditioned. Maria explained that this detachment isn't achieved through effort, but as a natural consequence of internal coherence. When the truth is felt within, external approval ceases to be essential. At this stage, the way of helping also changes. The person stops getting involved in everything. They learn to discern where their presence is needed and where it isn't, not from indifference, but from respect. Maria pointed out that intervening uninvited weakens both the helper and the recipient. This new awareness honors the processes of others without intruding. It accompanies when appropriate and withdraws when it isn't. There is also a refinement of silence. It is no longer just about being outwardly silent, but about reducing unnecessary inner dialogue. The mind learns to stop effortlessly, not because it no longer has thoughts, but because it no longer clings to them. This mental lightness allows for a deeper listening to intuition. Maria insisted that intuition does not shout, it guides gently. It can only be heard when the noise diminishes. The message mentions an interesting phenomenon. In this phase, some people feel that their environment reorganizes itself. Situations that previously generated tension settle down. People who didn't resonate with them drift away. Others appear precisely. It's not magic, it's coherence. When the inner world finds order, the outer world responds. Not always immediately, but consistently. Maria called this the silent confirmation. During the stabilization process, an unexpected nostalgia may arise. The person remembers old versions of themselves, past relationships, ways of living that no longer fit. It's not a desire to go back, it's a farewell. Every authentic transformation involves grief. Maria invited us to honor that grief without dramatizing it, to be grateful for what was and allow it to recede. Resisting this closure leads to stagnation. Accepting it releases new energy. The body was also discussed. The body accompanies this process with its own signals. Sleep patterns change. Food cravings change. The stress response changes. Maria explained that ignoring the body delays spiritual integration. Listening to it accelerates balance. The body is not an obstacle. It is a sensitive ally. Treating it with respect facilitates the entire process. At this stage, faith becomes less discursive and more embodied. The person doesn't need to explain what they believe. They live it. Their actions acquire a perceptible coherence. They don't seek to convince. They don't constantly debate. They simply act from a clearer perspective. Maria emphasized that this type of faith is difficult to imitate because it isn't learned through words. It's recognized by the peace it transmits without being ostentatious. However, the message cautions that this stage is not definitive. It is stable, but not static. Preparing the ground is not the same as reaping the harvest. Stabilization is necessary to sustain what is to come. Without this foundation, the next phase would feel like an overload. With it, it will be expansion. Maria was very careful not to reveal too much, but she made it clear that the process is not yet complete. An important observation from the message is this: those who manage to achieve stability often go unnoticed. They don't draw attention to themselves. They don't make a fuss. They don't create conflicts, and yet they are the ones who most effectively maintain collective equilibrium. Maria explained that the transformation of the world doesn't happen through spectacular actions, but through the sum of consistent presences. Each stable person contributes more than they realize. At the end of this section, Maria offered a brief but profound insight. Don't look for new signs. Learn to recognize the ones that are already there. Stabilization doesn't need extra stimuli. It thrives on constant attention. Those who learn to live attentively discover that what is essential is repeated simply, and in that repetition, truth is solidified. What follows in the next part enters even more delicate territory, the final tests of consistency, those that appear when a person already feels grounded. There, it will be revealed why it is precisely at this moment that the most subtle confusions arise, and how to navigate them without losing one's bearings. This phase doesn't happen to everyone at the same time, but it inevitably reaches those who persevere.